What's up YouTube? So today we are looking at creating psytrance bass lines in Ableton Live. So in case you're new here, this is not actually the usual on my channel. I'm one of those Bitwig folks. However, I know such a large amount of you folks are using Ableton that I figured I'm just going to show you how I would do it if I were using Ableton. So that being said, if you are new here, I would highly appreciate the like and the subscribe if you do like the content. Otherwise, let's just dive in and have a look. So I've got a loop here that I created in a previous video. It was like my first dive into Ableton Live. In fact, I have used it in the past, but it was like the first time in I think like 10 years or something. So I put together a bit of a loop in that video. Not too happy with the bass line for several reasons. So I figured I would show you how I would create a little bit more of a modern sounding psytrance bass. So unfortunately, the tools inside Ableton, like the wavetable synthesizer, don't offer all of the features that I generally need for a more modern sounding psytrance bass. So I'm going to go with something like Vital, which is actually a free synthesizer, which you can download. I'm sure you can just Google that. So anyway, Vital has several features which actually make it a little bit more advanced, specifically for creating wavetable processed bass lines. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to load up my plugin. So let's find Vital over here, and we can load that onto a MIDI track like this. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is to put in some notes to trigger the bass. So the track that I'm working on is in F. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put in a bunch of F notes. So in case you're kind of new to psytrance, the general progression is that we have a gap where the kick is, and then we have 3 bass notes. So we can choose to either kind of like have like a groove going on with a velocity where like the first one is a bit lower and stuff, but we're going to get a little bit more advanced later on in the video. So what I want to do quickly is just to select all of these. Now we have a bar with 4 kicks and 3 bass notes in between each of those kicks. So this is just the raw sound coming out of Vital. So there's a couple of setup steps that we're going to have to do to get it to sound like we want to. So first and foremost, let's set the random phase down to 0%. That way it's going to trigger the exact same sound every time the note is triggered. What the phase is where the sound starts. So at the moment we're at 180, which is the beginning of the cycle. And the more we shift this, the more it moves where the waveform is going to start when the sound starts playing. If this were up, it would just play at a different point every time. And that gives this a sound of instability. Perhaps if you're going for a more analog sounding lead sound or something like that, you may want to leave that on. But for bass lines in psytrance specifically, we want a very stable, static, punchy sound. So let's leave that at 0. So what I want to do is I just want to duplicate this across the entire bar that we've created here. And I can just solo this kick and bass group that I've created. So generally speaking, it's good practice to figure out a good fundamental root note for the bass, which is going to be close to the subtail of the kick. So if we look at the spectrum of the bass, let's say for example, I mean, you don't have to always do it exactly like this. You could potentially have a higher bass, specifically if you're working in F, because it's a lower key, it's not too much of an issue. If we were working in, for example, A, and we did a octave up, it would sound like a very high note. It would be too high for a bass sound, right? That would be more in the lead territory. So generally speaking, I'm sticking to the octave between C0 and C1. And if we look at the spectrum, you'll see that that first spike over there, that first spike, you want it somewhere around 40 to 50 hertz. So when you start going above that, then you start to head into kind of the mid-range territory. And you don't get that kind of like punchy low end from the bass sound. So anyway, so generally speaking, I will use the LFOs and set these into envelope mode over here. So we can do that, and we can also choose the speed that we want these bass notes to play. So I will go with 1/16, turn the smoothing down. And so here, what we want to do is we want to draw in an envelope shape that's going to represent the shape of what is modulating the filter. So generally with subtractive synthesis, we have a full frequency waveform. We then filter out some of the harmonics with a filter, and then we process it with effects. So how we would modulate this is by just dragging this over onto any of these parameters. So if we drop this onto the frequency over here, then we can actually change the bass frequency, which is like where it starts and where it ends, basically. So usually what I do is I'll have a combination of a kind of loose envelope and a very tight envelope. So let's set this to envelope mode, 1/16. And here we can draw in a much tighter envelope shape. And this is going to simulate just like the pluck of the sound. And so now we can use these little drag bars here to actually change the amounts of each of these. Okay, so now we can adjust this phase, which will change the offset of where that saw wave starts, right? But you notice how at that 180 mark, we're getting that nice pluck. So let's leave it at that. Okay, so say for example, we wanted to add some velocity sensitivity. Let's turn this level down and let's set this velocity onto the level. And so now it's going to modulate the level of this oscillator depending on the velocity that we choose here in the MIDI. So if we select these first notes, we can turn this down, right? To kind of simulate a sidechaining effect. Let's look at the sidechain. So essentially what we want to do is we want to create a more exact modulation of the volume of the sound. So you could do this with the LFO tool, you could do it with Polyverse Gatekeeper, which is another great tool for this kind of thing. I'm just going to use Snap Heap because it's another great tool, not just for sidechaining, for any type of processing. So here what we could do is we can create an LFO. We can set this to sync to 1/4, which is the speed of the kick. And now what we can do is we can draw in the kind of like LFO shape that we want on the volume. So here, let's say turn the volume down and then use this to modulate it up by 100%. So here on the first step, there'll be nothing interfering with the kick drum. And now we can actually change these curves if we want a kind of like more curve motion instead of like a exact square, you know? Okay, so that's the basics. Let's talk about some more advanced processing. So this is a tool called Oscillos Megascope. There are, of course, various different kind of oscilloscopes that you can use. The reason that I really like this one is it kind of automatically snaps to the grid. You can overlay the different waveforms, so you can kind of see them, how they sum together or how the phase is related to each other. So if we put one on the bass and one on the kick, we can actually compare the actual waveform without rendering it out to audio and seeing. You know, we can actually see it in real time, which is really, really handy. So let's set this to 1/4. Let's set this to overlaid. And then we might also just want to set this to fast, just so you can see it draw like that. And then here, let's set them to different colors, so it's a lot more apparent what's going on. So the reason why I really like this is because you can see exactly how, for example, the sum factor of these waveforms affects like the baseline. So the extreme example is, let's say, take away that sidechain that we had on the bass, and now let's look at the scope again. Notice firstly how we can quickly see that the tail of this is affecting the transient of the kick. See how the first kick is flat and the second one has this kind of DC offset. But also here is now peaking louder than that initial first transient because there's no sidechain effect happening there. So that's why we sidechain, to remove that first like overlaying with the kick transient, but also to often deal with that summing factor that's happening over here on the first bass note. So we could go into Vital and actually edit the wavetable. We could create like a phase offset, for example, like I said here. But generally speaking with that, I find editing the phase here tends to sound like you lose a bit of that transient, you know? And so I often use a really helpful tool by, also by Kilohertz, who do Snap Heap. The tool is called Disperser. What this does is it basically simulates multiband effect, and it just phase rotates the signal several times. That several times is basically represented by this amount over here. So I'm not saying go out and buy this plugin. So you can create a very similar effect using the built-in tools in Ableton, but stacking them up and stacking them up. What I'm going to do quickly is just open up a blank channel here. I want to put in Vital. And then here we can put in another one of those scopes. Okay, so now what we can do is we can just put in, I actually just want to solo just this channel. Then we can turn the volume of the output down all the way so we're not hearing it, but just so that that bass is not distracting. And put in one long note. Let's loop just this part. And so now we should be able to see this on the scope in real time while we change these effects. So here, for example, let's drop that disperser. And notice the effect that it's doing here. So I'm just going to reduce the amount a little bit. It does this kind of initial pluck, wobble, and low sine sweep like this. Essentially what it's doing is it's jumbling the phase of all of the harmonics. And as you kind of tune it, it changes. So you can kind of get different waveforms depending on how you set this up, right? So there is a roundabout method to do this using Ableton effects. I believe we use the multiband compressor, multiband dynamics, excuse me. You use the cutoff points over here to fine tune it. And so here, for example, we only have two cuts, right? So that's 2 phase rotations. Whereas I think in Disperser, you get up to 32. So to get the maximum that you would get out of Disperser, you would end up stacking it like 16 times. But we don't ever need to go that far. I find with Sidetrans bass is like, by the time you've hit 10, it's like sounds very wobbly. So like we generally just want like maybe 3 of these, and then we can jump in and actually fine tune these and just have a look at what it's doing to the waveform. Do you see here? It's a very similar effect to what we're getting with the Disperser. So the issue with this is that, let's say, for example, put in a very short note here, so I can show you an example, and I'm going to put it off the beat here, just one quick note like this. And if we look at the scope again, you see how the note is supposed to start here, right? Do you see how there's this space and then this post-ring effect which happens? So this is undesirable because it'll overlay, or it'll overlap with the next note, and then the next note will overlap with the kick, etc., etc., if we end up post-processing it this way. The trick, though, is to render this out as a WAV file and then just load it into Vital as an oscillator. I'm going to show you how to do that real quick. Let's just mess around a little bit and get a shape that's a bit closer to what I know to be like that disperser shape. Okay, that looks good. You also want something that's kind of even, not too balanced on the top, not too balanced on the bottom. So here we have this like wobble and a low sine. That looks good. So here what we can do is we can, okay, for some reason the dragging is not working, so I'm just going to render it out, you know, the traditional old method. So I'm just going to remove anything that's happening here. So I'm just going to render it out straight into the Vital Wavetables folder, and we can actually just search it here. What on earth? Okay, maybe I can drag it from that folder. So you can basically experiment. You can drop it. You see with the wavetable, if I drop it there, because there's those wobbles, it doesn't quite pick up the pitch correctly. You can fix it after the fact, but sometimes changing, like just dropping it on pitch splice, for example, it can automatically detect it. So try each of those modes, see which one results in the waveform being retained when you cycle through this frame, because we just want a static waveform, right? And so here we can actually jump in and we can edit the phase inside the wavetable editor. So over here, you see how there's this offset. Let's get this to start at the beginning by shifting this over like this. And we can move it over to the beginning of the waveform. Perfect. So now we should have that sound of the processed waveform, but as an oscillator inside Vital. I'm going to actually save this. So now we can jump back to the original bass patch which we made. And so if we ever mess this up, we can always just jump back and initialize back to the initial waveform, right? So here, let's just search Ableton MB9. Cool, we've got it. And so now that, remember I was telling you about that post ring and that pre-ring and everything, we've kind of dealt with all of that. The weird thing here is that Vital's phase 180 is actually here at the beginning, not here in the middle, whereas Serum it's the other way around. So that's one thing to remember, is that's the reason why we shifted the phase over there, is because I just find it easier to work that way, to leave it here and just to work with the window, if that makes sense. So here, let's listen to this bass sound now with that original MIDI that we created. How much better does that sound? We have that kind of like mid-range that's coming through as well because of that multi-band processing. So what I want to do quickly is let's just pop in the init here. I'm going to turn this off, and now we can quickly compare. I'm actually going to set up the velocity onto the level as well. And so now we can quickly compare which one sounds better, right? So this also needs to go to the filter. Sometimes you might want that phase just before this movement here, because of the way that the envelopes work. If it's exactly on that starting point, you might miss that initial movement. So sometimes moving it to like 360, which is the end of the phase cycle, and then shifting it back a little bit can actually give you a little bit more transient. So there is a volume difference. I believe it's because of like the processing and stuff. We can normalize table like this. Okay, it's automatically normalized. But we can just deal with that volume difference like after the fact. Okay, so sometimes I will EQ the bass ever so slightly, but I won't do too much kind of clinical cuts. For me, EQ on the bass, that kind of more clinical stuff I try to do in the actual synth patch for reasons like I explained. You know, too much of that clinical stuff can end up creating post-string and all sorts of other things like that, which might be undesirable to the transient. But for, let's say, just slight coloration and to fit it into the track creatively, EQ can be a really cool tool. So one example that I want to quickly make is to match the high frequency of the kick to a boost in the bass. So I'm going to put in an EQ onto the kick channel, and we can just monitor this. And let's look here. You see that we've got this kind of peak at 10K on the kick. So what I often do is I will observe that, so okay, around 10K, and then I'll do a little peak in an EQ on the bass around that. So not with this shelf. We want a peak, right? And I'll actually make it much narrower. And so the reason we're doing this is we're just accentuating a little bit of that frequency range in the bass, just to kind of glue the kick and the bass together a little bit more in the track, so that they sound like they're kind of coming from the same space because they occupy similar frequency ranges. Now, because they're not actually playing at the same time, you know, because the kick is playing separately to the bass, you're not going to get any of that frequency conflict. And so, you know, often you'll see in mixing tutorials and other stuff on the internet, people will say like, oh, cut this frequency from this one, but it's counterproductive because they're not actually playing at the same time. So at least in this genre. So then we can also just maybe remove some of the mid-range, and that gives us the ability to actually push the volume perhaps a little bit louder. Can you hear how it just livens up the transient of the bass a little bit? That deals with the basics of the sound design and the production mixing kind of stage of the kick and the bass. Now I want to talk about a couple of different grooves that I might use when writing a track. So a common groove that I like to use is to do alternating octaves. So let's say break it into just these two pieces here. Let's say move the last note up an octave and then the second note up an octave. So you get this kind of like alternating groove. And then if we just copy this in the next piece here, we get this same kind of alternating groove. So that's a really cool thing you can do. But you can also change it up. So like here, for example, we can go second one, last one, and then like you can do the first one like this and then change it up in the second one to create these different grooves, you know? I like that one. I like that one a lot. So here we can also change the notes. I like to use a +1 and a -2, or a +2 and a -1, never the two together. So let's say +1, -2. Awesome. I think that's where I'm going to leave it for today. I hope you folks enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you want more Ableton stuff, let me know in the comments as well. And yeah, if you haven't yet, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to my channel for more. I will see you guys next time. Cheers.